Yet here he was, stripped of his flesh, blood, and organs, an undead in the form of an elite skeleton at best. At that moment, the re-established connection allowed Sung-hyun to sense the odd sensation of being nothing but bones. Hans's race had been changed into an undead, and they obtained a special skill called Decomposed Heart. He retained his common and individual traits, but he was no longer human. Becoming undead was quite a shock that he was not expecting at all. However, due to the cleansing effects of the Mind Hub ability, his mind was not corrupted. Hans looked around, trying to find any clues as to where he was. He turned his head to the side and saw a small battalion of people with rotting flesh and some with no flesh at all lined up neatly. Based on the looks of this bizarre display, it might be possible that some twisted freaks were turning the entire village into undead beings. That was when a man walked into the room, seemingly pissed off. Hans did not dare move a muscle. Well, he didn't have any, so he tried to keep his bones as steady as possible. He remembered the man from the tavern yesterday. This dude was just bored after being confined in this remote mountain area, doing some seriously shady stuff for so long. Maybe the villagers Hans drank and celebrated with were dark magicians. Finally, the man noticed the skeleton sitting in the corner of the room, away from the rest of the undead. Hans tensed up at the man's glare. He was afraid that the fact he could move would be noticed. Thankfully, the man wasn't that sharp. He was just annoyed that he had to do some extra work. So, using an ominous voice, he ordered Hans to move over to the rest of the skeletons. His heart may already be rotten, but he could swear that he almost had a heart attack just then. The voice the man used strangely filled him with a power that beckoned him to move forcefully. It was faint enough that he could ignore the order if he resisted, but playing along and pretending to be under control would be the safest bet for now. The man was just done with his troublesome job and complained about how the old geezer was too meticulous, so he had to constantly check on the room. Finally, he left and slammed the door shut. Hans could not help but feel familiar with that feeling of control. Inside him was a power that was making it possible to make a body made up of bones move. Maybe it was because of the mana affinity trait. With a heightened connection to magic, he quickly figured out the crux of mana. If he could get some practice, it might be possible for him to control the other undead in this room. A week had passed since Hans died and turned into an elite skeleton in a strange village. He had been stuck in the concrete room, working around the schedule of the guards to sneak in some practice. Hans was trying to use his natural affinity with mana to command the other undead stuck with him. Today was the day that he managed to make some significant progress in his trial and error approach. He managed to make another skeleton move its lifeless body, standing up clumsily. He was finally making some progress. It took his full concentration to get one to move according to his will, but it was still too unrefined. Moreover, he was limited to controlling just one soldier. Maybe this was the limit of a mere elite skeleton. Hans heard a squeak that he had been hearing for the past week. A rat managed to sneak into the locked room, and the vermin was brave enough to skitter near Hans. He immediately grabbed the rodent off the ground, making it squeal. He finally got the rat that had been scratching his heel for the entire week. This fast little thing had been annoying him for a while now. Speaking of small and fast, Hans considered using the rat as an experiment subject instead of his fellow undead humans. He had nothing else better to do, so he might as well give it a try, right? Using his bony finger infused with mana, he killed the little rat in one stab. Its blood from the mortal wound scattered on the floor. With the rat dead, its corpse was now susceptible to the same principle that Hans had been practicing. Suddenly, the little rodent stood up with renewed vitality, as if it hadn't just been stabbed a moment ago. Hans quietly celebrated his successful experiment. He named this undead rat Alfred, and let him loose. This was the beginning of Operation Nightwatch. Using the inconspicuous animal, he could gather information by listening in on hushed conversations. Alfred was quite a valuable and effective asset when it came to espionage. Now Hans could have eyes and ears on the outside. The whiny grunt came back to the room, still unsatisfied with his working conditions under the old chief geezer. Hans could see the grunt fiddling with another locked room, possibly a warehouse of some sort. Curious, he pondered whether he should send Alfred the rat inside to investigate. He wanted more information, but a thick dark energy was preventing him from even walking near the doorway. Even with Mana Hub neutralizing his emotions, he could still instinctively feel the terror inside this mysterious location. Every one of his senses was telling him that it would be too dangerous to approach any closer. And so, he just waited for the grunt to get out, and listened in on a conversation between grunts regarding some sort of ripening process. Each grunt working under the village chief dreaded that ominous item inside the mysterious room. They called it the Fragment of the Immortal King. The village may look normal at first glance, but it was filled with guards watching every side. They'd also set traps in every building, even though only fools would dare sneak into this forsaken place. Alfred skittered away after obtaining some valuable info just by eavesdropping. Now he knew about the existence of this Fragment of the Immortal King. Confident that he could freely go around the village to gather some more info, he wondered where to find the man at the center of this mess, the bald village chief bastard. Unfortunately for Hans, Alfred, the undead rat's second life, is short-lived as he is spotted and killed by someone outside. There was no coming back from this. The culprit used some magical dark blade that spawned directly from the ground to take care of the rat. Of course, it was none other than the village chief himself. He was one vigilant son of a bitch. Even a rat could not escape his detection. Hans worried that he would be caught after this misstep. The chief just found it odd that an undead rat didn't exude the energy of black magic, but its body was strangely filled with dark mana. The bald bastard just chalked it up to the vermin dying of natural causes and transforming into an undead due to dark mana exposure. If that were the case, the investigation would be easy, as there's only one place overflowing with dark mana in this village. As soon as the sinister old man came up to his grunts, they tensed up. When they asked if Jeffy was in charge of the undead warehouse, they tensed up even more. Meanwhile, Hans was mourning Alfred's loss. Although it might have been short-lived, he really liked that rat, and he promised to take revenge on behalf of the little guy. Wherever Alfred's spirit might be, he better watch what Hans had in store for the bastards that put him in his current predicament. By sunrise, Jeffy the Grunt kicked the door of the undead warehouse open, visibly pissed for getting chewed out by his boss for letting a rat crawl in and sneak out of the room. Jeffy wanted to vent his frustrations on the undead, who listened and obeyed his orders. He looked at them as worthless, foolish things, incapable of forming thoughts or moving on their own. Jeffy, the Grunt, was so infuriated and irritated that he socked one of the rotting fleshy zombies right in the jaw for being too slow. Punching something right in the face definitely made the pathetic Grunt feel like a big man. He lifted the zombie's head by the hair to examine its face. Jeffy remembered this rotten zombie from back when he was still human. It was a family man who dared to rebel against the dark magicians to protect his family from a horrific fate and failed. Jeffy, the Grunt, dared the zombie to talk back now. Even if he hadn't been turned into a mindless zombie, he wouldn't be able to do so. Jeffy plucked this guy's tongue out before killing him after all. Finally, he lost interest in the poor undead after venting his anger and frustration. Jeffy missed the days of fun when all they did was hunt down every single person in the village for their mission. He thinks that turning the rebellious zombie's wife into an undead and putting them in the same locked room is a favor. The dark magicians never spared anyone, even young children. At that moment, the zombie stood up from the ground and pounced at Jeffy's shoulder, promising to take a big bite. Its bite was sudden and forceful, tearing through the Grunt's flesh, making him bleed, panic, and stumble. He tried his hardest to wrestle back control using the voice to order the zombie, but it was not working. Since the orders didn't stop the zombie from acting out of line, Jeffy busted out his offensive magic spell. Before he could finish casting, the zombie's undead wife also moved, grabbed, and shut Jeffy's stupid ass up, canceling the spell cast. He turned to see the rest of the undead that he was tasked to oversee bum-rushing him down with a vengeance. Jeffy the bastard suffered a painful series of attacks at the hands of the people that he killed and enslaved. Of course, the culprit was the elite skeleton situated at the back of the room. This was just the beginning of Hans's revenge. At the village entrance, a young man was hassling the guards to let him in, as he was allegedly looking for his brother inside, despite the guards' resistance. They refused to let an outsider in so carelessly, and the young man kept requesting to at least see the village chief. Finally, Chief Malcolm came to the gates to see what the commotion was all about. He introduced himself to the young man, and the guards fearfully made way. The old bald bastard was shocked to see the boy's face. It was a young man with an identical face to Hans. It was Heinz, pretending to be Hans's twin brother. Having two bodies to pull off plans like this was really handy. Thanks to Heinz distracting the old man away from the mysterious warehouse, Hans managed to sneak in where the fragment of the Immortal King was housed. This little dark purple fragment was no joke. The overwhelming power it emitted was palpable. It was absorbing the dark energy from the undead battalion he came with. No, it felt more like a mutual resonance rather than absorption. However, the undead beings stationed in this room looked insanely strong, much stronger than the room he was stuck in. Those guys must be the rejects. It pissed Hans off that he was classified as one of those rejects. He didn't even qualify to be trapped in this more important room. Acting out of his hurt pride, he grabbed the fragment and shoved it right into his empty chest. The overwhelming power of darkness exploded inside his ribcage. While this was happening, Heinz was trying his best to buy as much time as possible, keeping Chief Malcolm busy with his cheerful demeanor. He insisted that twins have a secret connection that would always pinpoint the location of one another. Malcolm continued playing along, acting like the benevolent leader. That was until he felt the energy disturbance inside the most important room in this entire village. Heinz and the guards noticed it too. Something was happening with the fragment. Chief Malcolm dropped all pretenses and raced off to the warehouse in his monstrous form as he ordered his guards to kill Heinz. Immediately, the two guards turned their spears against the young man. At least they tried to. Heinz was already out of there. He vanished into thin air. In the warehouse, Hans's mind was filled with immutable thoughts of despair, anguish, and every known negative human emotion all at once. Even though his mind was trying to keep up with the help of the Mind Hub, the intensity and pain were still too much to bear. Now that he was being subjected to the fragment's mental torture, he reckoned that there was not one person who could withstand this experience with their sanity intact. With one final explosion of dark energy, the entire room almost collapsed. The system notified him that he had met the conditions for evolution. Hans walked out of that tribulation as an immortal mage, a Demolich. After absorbing 1 out of 3 existing fragments of the Immortal King, the latent dark magic had assimilated into his body. With this evolution, he gained the special skill of evil wisdom, granting an absolute understanding and talent in dark magic. Clueless as to what was happening, another grunt was cursing Jeffy for getting him saddled with more work just because of a loose rat. His boredom was interrupted by a loud and angry mental message from the master. He reported that nothing was wrong with his post, but a disaster was already brewing with the fragment at the center of it all. The grunt tried to call on Jeffy so they could check out the commotion together, but he did not get an answer. When he got close to the door to take a closer look at what happened to his co-worker, the poor grunt was mobbed by the undead inside. Behind them was Hans, a Demolich with the ability to speak the human tongue and have his own free will. He stared at the grunt menacingly. It was about time to break out. The poor grunt used his magic in an attempt to drive the eager zombies away. The door eventually gave out, opening a cascade of undead monsters moving according to Hans's will. He continued talking to the grunt, freaking the poor guy out. Hans could feel the difference in his power level after his evolution. A significant part of it must have been the evil wisdom he obtained. Just by looking at and sensing anything related to dark magic, he could emulate and master spells instantly. In other words, it was an absolute cheat code. The already chaotic village was plunged further into chaos when the whole warehouse blew up in a fiery explosion. Hans calmly walked out of there and made the undead army come forth under his command. He ordered them to have their revenge and not to let a single one of these dark magicians escape. They must kill every horrible human in this village. And so, the undead rebellion started, with Hans as the catalyst. He was expecting an easy sweep of the village, but some of the elite skeleton soldiers started dying off little by little. That was because Chief Malcolm had joined the fray, and he was pissed as he wielded dark magic menacingly. The gentle old man act was fully out the window now. He wanted to know what this mere skeleton did to the fragment of the Immortal King. His real name was Marcos Giocali, an elder in the Vow of Defiance. Hans cheekily asked the elder if he still remembered him from a few days ago. Thanks to this bald demon, he literally lost his heart. He just took it upon himself to pick up a new one from the warehouse. The fragment was now deeply embedded and assimilated into his undead body. The elder gnashed his teeth in anger. To think that such a lowly undead skeleton would fuse with the fragment of the Immortal King was preposterous. In his fury, the old fart busted out a gnarly spell, the Finger of Death. Why would you finger a skeleton, bro? The swirling spell made of pure dark magic homed in on Hans. It moved too fast, and he did not have enough time to dodge out of the way. Fortunately, all it did was chop off one of his arms. It didn't even feel painful. He was just annoyed that the old fart would be so impolite and attack while he was still talking. The elder poured every resource and manpower he had for a whole year to hasten the maturation process of the fragment, so he was rightfully furious. He was so close to obtaining power stronger than anything imaginable, only for it to get snatched away by a wise-ass skeleton. The fragment was wasted on just turning an elite skeleton into a Demolich. With his fury, he built a nefarious thorn of darkness made purely from dark magic. Hans just realized that putting the fragment into his body must have been like putting a high-tier enchantment on a beginner weapon. He didn't care, though. In this world, he might be the only one who could make the assimilation work. He was certainly convinced that the old fart wouldn't be able to withstand the mental torture. The elder seemed fascinated with Hans's abnormal corrosion resistance, and he wanted to study his body as a test subject once all was said and done. Elder Marcos blasted a broken ectoplasm. Hans criticized the old bastard for being so corny and announcing the names of his skills when he was casting. In his heart, Hans was fighting this fight for the sake of Alfred's revenge. Not knowing who Alfred was, Elder Marcos asked if he was one of the villagers, suspecting that Hans must have infiltrated the village knowing what he was getting into. Suddenly, a potent mass of dark magic appeared on the old fart's flank. He managed to get a barrier up in time, defending against the wailing of dark energy. Elder Marcos was in a pinch, and he knew it. Hans was rapidly becoming accustomed to dark magic by the second, thanks to the power of the fragment. Believing that he couldn't afford to waste any more time while the skeleton was getting stronger, he pulled the trigger on the Pact of Destruction. Elder Marcos's men, who were trying their hardest to resist the attack of the undead, started behaving oddly in the middle of their respective battles. It started with a feeling of almost vomiting, followed by their souls and magic leaving their bodies. One by one, the dark magicians who had served under the old fart with loyalty over the years fell as their souls and magic were sucked away. Elder Marcos accumulated the souls and fashioned them into the crown of the broken. As he rested the crown on his bald head, he gained access to the resting place of the dead. This horrible boss just used the souls of his subordinates to amplify his own power. Hans might have endured the corruptive power of the fragment, but the old fart's next attack might be a different story. He shouted the long-ass name of the technique and was interrupted when he was about halfway through. All the old fart's posturing and trash talk were met with a single shot of fast-moving dark energy into the throat. He could only blame himself for having such elaborate spells. Hans almost fell asleep waiting for the whole title of the spell, so he just finished the fight in one attack. Anyway, thanks to Elder Marcos's display of skills, Hans learned a ton about dark magic quickly. To die such a stupid death was the Elder's final punishment. His life's work, everything that he dreamed of, everything was rendered useless in the hands of a strange skeleton. As the old fart breathed his last breath, Hans looked to the heavens, believing that Alfred the Rat was watching from above. He was probably at peace now that justice was served. Rest in peace, sweet prince. We all hope you get plenty of cheese in heaven.